Inspired this talk because I actually already gave this presentation to the Bible Foundations class. So if you're in that class, you'll get to see it again. It's a fun one. This is something that you won't see very often. This is kind of an unusual, I don't know if I even want to call it a sermon. It may almost more be of a presentation. But as you guys probably know by now, I would hope, as I try to talk about it as much as possible, I'm very passionate about apologetics. I think the defense of the Christian faith is something crucial in the world today. The guy who wrote the book that we're going to be talking about today, his name is Dr. Turek, and he always says, people are getting talked out of Christianity today because they've never been talked into it in the first place. And that's why I think apologetics is so important. So as we get into this conversation, it's going to be a fun one, I think. Just keep that in mind. Let's see if I can find the spot where the clicker's at. Down? Wrong one? There we go. Okay. So in the Bible Foundations class, we try to answer these questions because when we're talking about apologetics and the defense of the faith, you're trying to answer questions about the world, i.e. worldview. And the questions are, where do we come from? Where did life originate? What are good and evil? Where do they come from? And what happens to us when we die? These are questions that whether we admit it or not, I think every one of us will ask at some point in our lives. Maybe you say, I haven't asked it yet. You will at some point. Some people don't really start to think about what happens when we die until you're almost there, but nonetheless, we think about it. And these questions are really important. And I would also say that these questions tie into stories that we see. And one thing I do want to read that's not on the slides, but I think is important before we get into this, is in Acts 17. And the context is that Paul is going to Athens. And it says, quote, he also had a debate with some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers where he told them about Jesus and his resurrection. And they said, what's this babbler trying to say with these strange ideas he picked up? Others said, he seems to be preaching about some foreign gods. And if you skip down a little bit, Paul says, standing before the council and addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through, I saw many stones, and one of the altars with the inscription on it, to the unknown God. This God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about today. So some people may have a problem with some of the stories that are addressed in this book and in what we're going to talk about because they think they are secular and they think that they have stories that Christians shouldn't have any business watching, listening to, or reading. But what you see there in the story with Paul is that he's taking the secular, idolatrous nature of the people in Athens and using that philosophy to talk to them about Jesus. You see, it says in there that there was this altar they built. These people of Athens had so many gods, and they really didn't know which one was real. They were just trying to save their own butts. They were like, okay, which one do we worship so that we don't get destroyed? So they said, well, what if we're missing a god? This is where their logic went. They said, if we're missing a god, what if there's one that we don't know about? Well, the solution they came up with is we're going to build this big altar to a god, and we'll just call it the unknown God, and we'll sacrifice to it just to be on the safe side. And Paul comes in, and instead of Paul coming in and saying, hey, you heathens, how dare you be offering idols and worship to these other gods? He says, no, let me use that. Let me take that philosophy. And he even, there that it said Epicureans. We're going to actually talk about Epicurus, where that philosophy originated. And I'm going a little fast just because of time. This is a lot of material. Hopefully you're able to follow it. But as we get into this, just keep an open mind and think about things maybe differently than you have before, because I certainly thought about things differently than I had before. In fact, in this book that we're about to talk about, there's actually a chapter about Harry Potter, of all things. Some Christians wince when they hear that. Some Christians are like, how dare you talk about Harry Potter? Harry Potter is demonic. But in this book, he actually points out how many parallels there are to the Christ story in Harry Potter and how J.K. Rowling did not do that by accident. So I just thought I'd point that out too. In this book, let's see if I can get the slide to go here. And can we move to the next slide if I can't get the clicker to work? Oh, there we go. Figured that would happen. It's just kind of inevitable. Okay. So the other questions we try to ask are about Jesus and the story of Jesus. Who was he? Who did he claim to be? And if he was who he claimed to be, and if he did indeed rise from the dead, then we can trust him and we are saved. And if he did rise from the dead, then we will raise to life again and have eternal life with him. These are the answers and the consequences of Jesus being who he said he was. If we go on to the next slide, attempt to at least. Okay, so I have a question for you guys. This is a fun one. Hopefully I don't skip forward because it'll ruin it. But What do you think is the most watched movie in all of history of the world? This says, according to the New York Times, this film is likely the most watched film. What is going on? Can we go back to that other slide? Okay, there we go. Don't go any, okay. Anyway, you know what, let's just ask the question. I'm not going to read it. What's the most watched film? Anyone have a guess? Lord of the Rings is probably up there, but that's not the one that New York Times says. Hobbit? By the way, Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien had a lot of Christian parallels. That's not the one we're talking about here. Star Wars, Chronicles of Narnia? Nope, none of those. Avatar? Avatar's close, but no. By the way, I don't expect you guys to get this. I would have never gotten this in a million years. Those are all probably up there. I like it. Kung Fu Panda, I'm sure. Shrek. The Incredibles. You guys, I'll just say this. You're not too close. And I'm just going to reveal it because we could be here a while. It's actually Jesus. The movie about Jesus from the 1970s. According to the New York Times, this movie has been watched, according to repeat viewings, 6 billion times. 6 billion times. That's more than any of those other movies. And I have never actually even seen this film. But this movie was about Jesus, and it's the most watched movie of all time. And we have shows like today, like The Chosen. You have movies like The Passion of the Christ, which are also, they're up there in popularity. Because this one guy, the story of Jesus. And that's what we're talking about today, is the story of Jesus. Okay, the book we're going to talk about is called Hollywood Heroes, How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God, by Frank and Zach Turek. And you can see there the cover art of Superman, but you have the cross, because our stories point to his story, as Sammy alluded to. It's a really fun book. I'd highly recommend it. It just came out recently, conveniently, right around May 4th. I don't think that was an accident. If we go on to the next slide here. So I'm not actually going to play the video, but yeah, so movies and the problem of evil. So there's a specific movie we're going to talk about that kind of just popped up on the screen. It's not a movie I would have expected to be the one I would pick to talk about, but Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, addresses the problem of evil. I know, it silly does, right? We're like, what do you think you're going to do a sermon or a talk in a church about these secular movies about Batman beating up Superman? This movie wasn't even that good, actually. Oh, it was, okay. That's for another time. We should have a debate over that. Well, okay. But Batman vs. Superman and the problem of evil. If you've seen the movie, you may remember the scene that I'm not going to play here just for time's sake, but we'll quote Lex Luthor, because Lex Luthor is the villain of this movie. And in this next slide here, and we go on to the next one. Yeah. He says, quote, this is actually, so he quotes Epicurus. So to give some background, Epicurus was a philosopher, a Greek philosopher, that was referenced in the Bible in Acts 17, which he just read. He says, if God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he's not omnipotent. If he's able and not willing, then he's malevolent. If he's both able and willing, then where did evil come from? And if he's neither able nor willing, why call him God? So something in apologetics and film and all of this in the world today we need to understand is we need to understand the other side. So obviously, I don't prescribe to this idea, but it's one of the most prominent arguments against God today. And it's been around for hundreds of years. We even see that Paul was debating these very people. Epicureans is who he was debating. So this idea is not new. And I just found it funny that in Batman vs. Superman, a secular superhero movie about Batman and Superman, the character of Lex Luthor goes on a tirade for about 3 minutes about why he doesn't like God, why he's against God, and he makes the argument Epicurus made about God. And he's referring to both God himself and Superman and kind of combining them because he too sees the parallels between the character of Superman and Christ. And I believe that's because when the character of Superman was created, whether they realized it or not, the creators took influence from the Christ story because it's the most powerful story you could ever read. If you go on to the next slide, I did summarize this quote better by saying this. If God wants to stop evil, but he doesn't stop evil, which obviously he doesn't, right? There's evil in the world. He must not be all-powerful because if there's still evil in the world, God must not be powerful enough to stop it. Next one would be, If he's all powerful then, so now we're saying, okay, he is all powerful, then he must not want to stop evil because it's still here, which would make him the creator of evil, which isn't really a God that we like or want to worship. So that's a problem. And if he's all powerful and all good, why is there evil in the world? Because that seems to be a contradiction. Again, I don't agree with this. We're going to make an argument against it in just a second. But this is what Epicurus made. And it's a very powerful and persuasive argument that you still see today. And finally, if he is neither all powerful or all good, why would we even call him God? Why would I worship him? Why does it even matter? The answer would be it doesn't, if that's the case. I don't think that is the case, but that's what Epicurus' argument is. This argument seeped into a superhero film, which is kind of the point. If we move on to the next slide here, here is the solution, I think, to the problem of evil. And I'm not going to try to argue against it myself because I think most of the time I can find a quote that'll say it better than me. So J.M.L. Monsaber said, "If God would concede me his omnipotence for 24 hours, you would see the changes that I would make. But if he gave me his wisdom too, I would leave things as they are." So to summarize that, because again, this is a little bit of old English. He was a priest, and he used older English. If we were to go on to the next one here. Yep. If God gave me unlimited power, I would change a whole lot of things in the world. I think we can all agree with that, right? If you had unlimited power tomorrow, you would change a lot. I would change a lot for sure. But he points out, and this is the solution. He says, but if God gave me his wisdom too, I would change nothing at all. And this is the point that he's making. He's saying, yes, there's evil in the world, but there also can be a good and all-powerful God. And it's hard for us to comprehend, but let's keep this in mind. Is that a necessary contradiction? No. It could be true. We may not be able to understand it, but that doesn't mean it's not true. And he points out that the wisdom that God has, the perspective that he has over all of time is something we can't even fathom. You think of the story in Genesis 50 of Joseph being sold into slavery, and years down the line, you see that his brothers come to him asking for food. And even though he was sold into slavery, they find out, oh man, now he's the second most powerful man in Egypt, and he has all this power. And then in the end of Genesis 50, their father passes away. And his brothers go, this is really bad for us. Joseph now has no reason not to kill us. They think their brother's going to kill him for what they did. That would be that would be justice, right? They sold him into slavery. He'd take revenge. But we don't see that. We don't see him doing that. We see him saying instead, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, the saving of many lives. It's the butterfly effect. And that's what he's saying, is that we may not be able to see the full picture, but just because there's evil in the world does not mean that there's not an all-powerful, all-loving God. It's not a necessary contradiction. It may be hard to understand. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not a contradiction. So if we move on to the next point, our stories point to his story. And we're dividing this into two sections because the reason I go on that little tangent about the problem of evil is because, for one, it's the most powerful argument, I think, against God. And for two, because it was in a movie, once again. It's in a movie about Batman and Superman. That's a little strange, isn't it? So if we go on to the next slide, I'm not even clicking it anymore, by the way. Thanks, AV team. People love stories. Now, it's on another slide here, but I'm just going to do it here instead. Why do we love stories? Anyone want to shout out reasons why we like stories? They connect us, yes. Relatable, yes. Entertaining, for sure. Educating, yeah, for sure. They do make us laugh, yeah. Some good funny movies out there. Anyone else? Those are good answers. Yeah. Those are the ones that I would have thought of too. One that I would have thought of was escapism. Another thing I'd say is that they're real, or they're parables, or analogies and allegories. I think whether the creators realize it or not, when movies are made, they take inspiration from the story of Christ because it's the most powerful story ever told. And you can look at quotes. In the book, Hollywood Heroes, there's a couple quotes that are really notable. For one, talking on Star Wars, George Lucas said that he created Star Wars and put the Force in there to instill a sense of spirituality in young people. Not necessarily a belief in any particular God, but a belief in God nonetheless. So George Lucas freely admits, yes, the Force is supposed to get people thinking about God. J.K. Rowling, the creator of Harry Potter, the person who's come under so much fire for so many things, said, yes, there's a lot of Christian imagery in Harry Potter. I don't talk about it a lot. I don't point it out openly because I don't want people to get distracted from the story, but it's there. In fact, Harry Potter, which I haven't even seen, by the way, but I read about it in this book. It was fascinating that the tombstones in Harry Potter have Bible verses on them, and J.K. Rowling said that those Bible verses sum up the entire Harry Potter saga in just those 2 verses from the Bible. The movies that Christians boycotted talk about Christianity, and their stories, the story of, a prophesied child going on to give his life to save the world. You ever notice these parallels? Anakin in Star Wars, where he's the chosen one who's born of a virgin and goes on to save the world. I don't think it's a coincidence that all of our stories seem to be so similar to this Christ story, because it's relatable, it's powerful, it's true. I don't know if any of you know who Dr. Jordan Peterson is, but he's somebody who is a deep psychological, deep thinker. And he hasn't outright come out and said he's a Christian, but one time he said, talking about the Bible just nails human nature. And he says, in that sense, it's true. In that sense, it's even more than true. Referring to the Bible, Jordan Peterson, not necessarily a Christian. It's all over. It seeps into everything in the world. We're going to the next one. So there's a picture on the last slide. Jesus told stories, right? Jesus told parables all the time. If we go on to that next one, it says in Mark, referring to Jesus, in fact, in his public ministry, he never taught without using parables. But afterwards, when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything to them. Jesus told stories to get a point across. And the stories we have in our world today, whether they be secular or not, we can use them to get a point across. And we can use them to see a picture of the ultimate hero, that being Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. If we go on to the next slide, I'm just going to pretend to click the clicker. We like stories. Why? We can skip that one because we already did that. So I'm going to read for you a poem. And this poem is one of my favorite poems I've ever heard because it's powerfully written, it's easy to understand, and yet it is some of the most powerful apologetic material I've ever seen. This poem, I actually got it. I think my grandpa sent me a Christmas card, and I read it. I was like, this is good stuff. I think I've actually presented it before to Vespers, so you may have heard this. But it showed up again in the Hollywood Heroes book when I was finishing reading it the other day. And I said, this is the extended version of the poem that's even better. So it says, he was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. We go on to the next one. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never lived in a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things we normally associate with greatness. He had no credential but himself. If you go on to the next one. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He never turned over to his enemy. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between 2 thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. Going to the next one. This is my favorite part. 20 centuries have gone by, and today he's the central figure of the human race. I am well within my mark when I say that of all the armies that ever marched, of all the navies that ever sailed, of all the parliaments that ever sat, of all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as this one solitary life. J. Warner Wallace wrote a book called Person of Interest. We'll go back to the last slide. Person of Interest. Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. And he points out in this book that if you were to take modern art, let's say that somebody, for hypothetical sake, burned every single New Testament copy on the entire planet. You had no access to the New Testament, you had no Bible on your phone, you had no internet, no New Testament. You could reconstruct the entire story of Jesus of Nazareth just from paintings from the first few centuries after his life. There's no person who's ever been written about, no person who's ever been sung about, no person who's ever had more movies or films made after them than Jesus of Nazareth. And the question is, when it comes to our choices in our life, when we decide what are we going to do with him? And this is what C.S. Lewis said, if we go on to this next slide. What do we do with Jesus? We got to decide. It's either everything or nothing. We move on to the next one. C.S. Lewis said, I'm trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, that is Christ. People often say, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. You notice I underline this right here. That is the one thing we must not say. The one thing, C.S. Lewis said. C.S. Lewis actually said, it's okay to deny Jesus, but the one thing you can't say is that he was just a moral teacher. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic on the level of a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. Notice the strong language here. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something even worse. You can shut him up as a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at your feet and worship him as Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He did not leave this option open to us, and he did not intend to. That's powerful language, isn't it? Also, C.S. Lewis, you know what he wrote? What did C.S. Lewis write? Narnia, right? Do you know who convinced C.S. Lewis to be a Christian? Anyone know? Tolkien. What did Tolkien write? Lord of the Rings. Two big blockbusters that were mentioned earlier when I asked what the most viewed movie was. Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia. Some movies, I mentioned that maybe people don't know what they're putting in the movie when they put the Christ myth as part of their story. Tolkien knew, Lewis knew, those movies are clearly modeled after Christ. Clearly. But once again, we're left with what C.S. Lewis said. The most powerful words I think Lewis ever said, or my favorite quote outside of Scripture itself, would be on this next slide. Christianity, if false, is of no importance, but if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. I like to sum that up by saying it's either everything or it's nothing. There's no middle ground, like C.S. Lewis said. That's the one thing we must not say. But I hope tonight we've maybe been able to think about things we may not have thought of before, like the impact that Jesus made on the world. The fact that so many of our stories point to him. The fact that Jesus' fingerprints are everywhere. You know, even when it goes back even further, just to the evidence of God himself. There's a song, Evidence of God. Every mountain, every valley, your creation, it surrounds me. Every breath I breathe, every heartbeat, every sunrise that you give to me. These and so much more tell a story we cannot ignore, the evidence of God. It's all around us. It's everywhere. And as I close out here, as I land the plane, it probably went way over my time. I just challenge you. Think about it, and what's your verdict in the case for Christ? What's your verdict? As C.S. Lewis said, it's either everything or it's nothing. And as we close out, I think I'm just going to pray out, actually. I think we already did our music. I hope that this has been thought-provoking. I pray for us as we all go back tonight, and I think we'll end off. So bow your heads with me. Dear Lord, thank you for today. I thank you for the fun day that the seniors had, and I hope and pray that the other students here at Auburn had a fun day MAPS testing, I guess. I don't know. Lord, I thank you for all of our blessings. I thank you that we're able to be here tonight at Vespers. I thank you for working all things out for the good of those who love you and are called according to your purpose. I thank you for what you did on that cross, Lord, and I thank you for giving us your word to tell us more about you. Lord, thank you for your son. Thank you for the cross, and thank you for forgiving us in spite of the fact that we don't deserve it. I just want to thank you once again, Lord, for all of our blessings, the ones we realize and the ones we don't, and the cross. Amen.